Hi, everybody. I'm going to walk you through the proposed zones in Z2501, the proposed zoning bylaw that council is considering and that is being reviewed by the public currently. Um, the disembodied voice you are hearing is Xander Gopin, Senior Planner at the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission. There's no need for you to see me, so you'll just be hearing me as I go through the slides. It'll really help you to know what zone your property is in. Um, so if you don't already know that, there's a virtual map on the Town of St. Andrews website. You can enter your address in and figure it out that way. I've got some contact information at the end of this, although you may already know how to get a hold of me. So if you have any questions after this, feel free to get in touch with me. Um, so we'll start looking at the overall zoning map. Um, Again, this view is probably not particularly useful if you're interested in a particular property, but this kind of helps show the logic of it. Um, I'll talk a little bit about each zone as we go through them, so I won't spend time doing that right here. But there are conservation zones, an industrial zone, some different types of rural zones, some different types of urban zones, and then there's some overlay zones which aren't shown on this map just because it gets cluttered and complicated. But I will talk about those at the end. Um, when we go through each zone, first I'll show just a map of that zone so you can see where it is. Um, we'll talk about the different uses that are allowed in that zone, main uses, secondary uses, um, accessory uses, different zone standards. So where buildings can be placed on a lot, how tall they can be, things like that. The land uses, in some cases, you really need to look at the definitions to understand what they mean. So I'll talk about some of those definitions. I won't talk about all the definitions, but the ones that aren't intuitive, I will talk about and show you. As well, some of the land uses have general standards that do not necessarily um, impact any particular zone. They just are relevant for that use wherever it is. So if those are relevant, I'll talk about those. I won't talk about all of the general standards. I'll really just touch on the general standards for specific land uses, just because otherwise it would be probably a 3-hour presentation. But again, if you have specific questions about anything, feel free to get in touch with me. So the first zones we'll talk about are the conservation zones. The higher priority conservation zone, C1, that's the darker green, that's for conservation of the natural environment with extremely limited development and no population density. These are areas around watercourses, wetlands, the Shamcook drinking watershed zone B and A within 75 meters of the water itself. And there's a few other provincially identified areas, some buffer areas around industrial zones. So that's the C1. C2 gets into the zone uh, two, zone C of the watershed. Um, Zone C2 is lower priority conservation for minimal development and low population density, passive recreation, and other minimal impact land uses to protect water sources, riparian areas, and important natural areas. You can also see in some of the urban areas, there's parkland that's in this zone, as well as some kind of low, super low impact development on Navy Island. So the C1 zone, the high priority conservation zone, very limited conservation uses. So things that are not impacting the land. Public utility uses, there are cases when these are needed, and pre-existing uses. And I'll talk about what pre-existing uses mean in a second. There's also secondary uses where you have that pre-existing use, which typically in this case would be a residential use. So there could be a short-term rental or home-based business. The zone standards are fairly limiting. It's not really expected to be new buildings developed, but if they are, they're limited in height to 9.1 meters, which is kind of a standard for the rural areas. Um, if you look over here on the right, this is all pages directly from the zoning bylaw, I should also say. There's really no information in this presentation, no visuals that are not in the zoning bylaw. So this is what you would see. Hopefully you have had a chance to read through it, maybe you're even flipping through it as we go through. So we show here a diagram with the minimum lot frontage, minimum lot depth. In this case, this zone requires 75% of the lot to be set aside for the preservation, maintenance, and growth of trees. Also talks about minimum lot size. This zone depends on, and a lot of the rural zones depend on if there's frontage on a public street. Um, Sometimes they refer to public infrastructure like sewer systems. You also see lot coverage. Over here is the height. And this is just kind of text that says refer to these diagrams. So some uses that I'll talk about that are mentioned here, the conservation use means use of land that serves to protect, maintain, or improve an environmental resource or feature that may include passive recreation, but does not include developing buildings or structures. So, maybe some trails, but very, very minimal. Pre-existing use is an interesting one um, because there's a basic standard in planning in New Brunswick and most places that existing legally allowed uses may continue, but that continuance is very restricted. It can be very hard to issue building permits. So a pre-existing use, the way it's defined here, a pre-existing building or structure or use of land that was lawfully permitted prior to and where the use was in existence and continued uninterrupted afterwards, the date of approval of the Town of St. Andrews zoning bylaw. That's a use that has a little bit more property rights than a legally non-conforming use. We'd be able to issue building permits. There may be the opportunities to expand within the zone standards. So you'll see these definitions come up again. I won't talk about them again, but it's also important to understand the logic of the zoning bylaw. You have your definitions are kind of the first thing. Then there's kind of very general clauses, generally not particularly relevant to everyday people developing. Then you get into kind of administrative clauses, then it's general standards, then it's the zones themselves. So if you are looking through, I'm trying to kind of show you as it would apply to a particular zone, but if you're looking through the bylaw, you'll find all the definitions in the front. So the next zone is the low priority conservation zone, and it permits a few more uses. Here you can do a camp, as well as that conservation use, dwellings, mini home, park, an open space use, and a residential cluster development. Secondary uses, accessory dwelling unit, institutional use, short-term rental, and home-based business, as well as accessory uses. The height allowance here is a little bit more generous at 15 meters. Because this is it's expected to have development in it. And again, you could have those institutional uses. And I'll talk about those definitions in a second. I'll just jump over to the zone standards. This is a very standard kind of rural lot, 54 meters frontage, 38 meters of lot depth, 1 acre requirement. It does depend on street frontage, just like with the previous zone. There's less requirements for the preserved area. It's only 25% in this case. And because there's expected to be more residential development here, there's a dwelling unit cap of 1 per acre, and that's basically a provincial standard. There is the opportunity to have an accessory dwelling unit. So if you have a bigger lot, then maybe you can have more than one, but you may be able to have more than one on an existing lot. I'll talk about the residential cluster development because it's a bit of a new concept. It means a bare land condominium or residential land lease community on a parcel of land that is not subdivided into lots within the meaning of the Community Planning Act. So it's not being subdivided, where the dwellings are clustered together on one part of the land in order to preserve for a conservation use at least 75% of the original parcel through conservation easements. So that's the definition. And then there's some standards. It talks about the zones they can be developed in, which, we're in the C2 zone here. So those are matching up. And it's talking about 4 or more dwelling units or mini homes. If there was to be a mini home park developed, this would be the form it would take. There's other acts that deal with these things that it needs to go through. So the Condominium Property Act, Assessment Act, driveway access being limited to 365 meters from a public street. This is a very standard requirement to ensure firefighting access and public safety. Ensuring water supply is adequate. In the definition, it talks about the 75%. So this is just kind of reinforcing that. Talking about the minimum lot size overall. If you're going with this type of land use, which is, it's not expected this will be a typical land use here, more likely to be your kind of camps or dwellings, but this is an interesting option to use land more efficiently and preserve natural features and use maybe common septic systems, things like that. One other definition I'll talk about here is home-based business, because that's an allowed secondary use. It's an allowed secondary use in most zones, especially ones where a commercial use is not an allowed main use. So it's a small-scale commercial use that operates within a dwelling or an accessory building to a dwelling, such as a garage, may occupy a total floor area of up to 10% of the dwelling. Up to 10% of the gross floor area of the main building, may include a child care facility operated out of a dwelling. From the outside, there is no visible evidence of the use except for small signs permitted under section 3.82 of the bylaw. That's the sign section, which we'll talk about at the end. Any equipment used must be kept indoors and properly soundproof to avoid noise disturbances. In addition, only one employee who is not an occupant of the dwelling is permitted to work in the home-based business at any given time. Home-based businesses are something that's been allowed through zoning for a long time. Allows for very small-scale entrepreneurship, increases neighborhood vibrancy. So it's a very good thing to allow, and you'll see it again, but I won't talk about the definition again. So going from conservation zones, which are very limited in development, to industrial zone, which is very permissive in development and where the highest intensity development would happen. It's for industrial and development, intensive agriculture, utility, forestry, and water-dependent fishery uses, such as lobster holding facilities. So it basically is the current industrial park and a few other existing industrial uses, including warehousing near the highway intersection. So I think this is actually one of the more self-explanatory zones. Does allow for these more intensive uses like agriculture. Can also practice conservation there. Forestry. The industrial uses are generally expected to occur here. Utility uses are expected to occur, and resource excavation. You can also have some secondary uses, large-scale commercial uses. So this might be your kind of, your big box stores. Sometimes in industrial parks, there's retail components, but there's still, large buildings with big parking lots and things like that. Dwellings, this is seen as more and more important for industrial areas, especially where you have kind of short-term needs for workers who aren't there permanently. They aren't necessarily settling in a community. They're really there to complete a project in a week or two or maybe a month, and so they need some kind of dwelling on site. And it doesn't make sense for them to be elsewhere in the community. So standards. Height, very permissive, pretty significant setbacks. Also, where this lot exists, there's green space buffering around it. And dependent on sewer and water systems, you can have different lot frontages and lot areas. So some of the definitions: industrial use means the use of land, buildings, or structures for warehousing, biological production, licensed cannabis production, manufacturing, processing, fabricating, assembly, servicing, treatment, or packaging of previously prepared or refined materials, or from raw materials that do not need refining. This use may include the raising, slaughter, processing, and storage of livestock or aquatic species. This use may include the servicing, treating, and recycling of articles or end products for a salvage use. This use may involve hazardous and commonly recognized offensive conditions, but does not include forestry uses, which aren't allowed use in the zone, so they could still happen here, or the storage and disposal of untreated chemical, biological, explosive, and radioactive wastes as a main use. Resource excavation use, as another main use, is defined as the use of land for excavation of sand, gravel, clay, shale, limestone, or other mineral deposit for a development or for the sale or other commercial use of the material excavated, but does not include processing or refinement of materials or an extractive industrial use. Extractive industrial uses can only happen through an amendment to this bylaw. There's also general standards for resource uses and specific types of resource uses. So a resource excavation use must meet the following minimum standards. These are all provincial best practices as recommended by the Department of Natural Resources. So no excavation shall be undertaken within 30 meters of any wetland or watercourse, within 30 meters of a street or highway, and below the groundwater table, except in the case of quarries and mines, which have their own standards. The excavation site shall be a minimum distance of 30 meters from all lot lines and 7.5 meters from power lines and 150 meters from any dwelling on any lot. A treed buffer of at least 15 meters in width shall be maintained between the final perimeter of any excavation site and any public street or adjacent property. A driveway access to the site shall have a barrier to control entry to the site. All excavation sites shall have adequate signs warning people of any dangerous situation associated with the operation, such as but not limited to blasting, steep slopes, or open holes. Such signs shall be posted around the perimeter and any driveway access. All surface water shall either be contained within the site limits or the resource excavation development shall require the necessary approval from the Department of Environment and Local Government. The excavation site shall not serve as a salvage yard. Any driveway access within 100 meters of an existing dwelling on any other lot shall not be used for transporting excavated materials. And prior to commencing any excavation upon any lands, a copy of an archaeological impact assessment, as approved by the Department of Tourism, Heritage, and Culture, shall be submitted to the development officer where that department determines a need for an AIA. Standards specifically for gravel pits. In addition to those above requirements, the land shall not be used for temporary or permanent asphalt production. No excavations involving any blasting of aggregate or mining shall be permitted, and the land shall not be used for aggregate crushing. Standards for quarries or mines. In addition to the requirements of Section 4.13, a resource excavation use in the form of a quarry or an extractive industrial use is subject to this section and the following minimum standards. Prior to commencing of an excavation upon the lands, a copy of a rehabilitation plan, as approved by the Department of Environment and Local Government, shall be submitted to the development officer where applicable. If the use involves a slope steeper than 1 1/4 meters horizontal, the excavation site shall be surrounded by a fence or barrier, a 10-meter buffer of cleared vegetation of all slopes, and brightly colored 1-meter square warning signs placed at 20-meter intervals along the top length of the slope. Prior to the commencement of an excavation upon the lands, all development and activities shall comply with all applicable acts, permits, and approvals as required, including but not limited to the Mining Act, Air Quality Regulation, Clean Air Act, Environmental Impact Assessment Regulation, Water Quality Regulation, Clean Environment Act, approval to operate, approval to construct, watercourse and wetland alteration regulation, water well regulation, Clean Water Act, Quarriable Substance Act, and the Species at Risk Act. Except with the written consent from the owner of a lot with a dwelling, extractive industrial use, or a resource excavation use involving the blasting, crushing, or processing of rocks or minerals shall not take place within 600 meters of a dwelling on another lot. So the next zone we'll talk about is the R1 low intensity rural zone for stable rural areas with limited population growth potential. To prevent intrusion of incompatible uses such as intensive resource development or industrial uses. Small scale and low intensity agriculture and resource development, commercial and tourism uses, such as campgrounds, developed with limitations and at a scale that is compatible with established rural residential uses. So you can see the main uses here, camp, dwelling, mini home, parks and open space, residential cluster development. Um, in addition to those main uses, these are other main uses you can have with a combined gross floor area of less than 200 square meters. So the scale is very limited. That can be agriculture, forestry, and institutional use, and a small scale commercial use. And then it's your kind of standard secondary uses. Fairly typical rural height, rural lot standards, slightly reduced minimum lot depth, but there's still the um, 1 acre lot requirement where there's public road frontage and greater if not. So some of the definitions and general standards that are relevant to this zone, camp means a lot, parcel, or piece of land intended for periodic recreational use and occupied on a seasonal basis by a maximum of one of the following: a trailer, camper, truck camper, tent, dome, yurt, or similar transportable accommodation, e.g. a cabin on a non-permanent foundation, but does not include dwelling units. For the purpose of this bylaw, more than one camp on a lot shall be considered a campground. A campground is a lot, parcel, or piece of land intended for periodic recreational use and occupied on a seasonal basis by multiple trailers, campers, truck campers, tents, etc., and includes campgrounds operated for tourism or commercial or non-commercial purposes, but does not include dwelling units. Now, once you have a campground, there are various standards that apply. So that lot where the campground is developed needs a 20-meter wide buffer along all lot lines. There must be a main building with a dwelling unit, so something that's occupied by a usual resident of the land. If 9 or more camps are developed, that a water supply assessment prepared by an engineer or geoscientist is provided to the development officer. Some other definitions relevant to this zone: institutional use is the use of land, buildings, or structures for community or public purposes, such as, but without limiting the generality of the following: a religious use, cemetery, an indoor or outdoor recreational facility, a child care facility, a cultural use or community hall with an associated licensed premise, a residential care facility, a public utility use, a school or educational institution and dormitory, hospital, healthcare office or clinic, a government office, building, or service center, but does not include a correctional facility or a supervised consumption site. An accessory dwelling unit. That's a secondary use in many zones. It's a dwelling unit with no more than 2 bedrooms, which is incidental to the principal dwelling unit. When contained within the main building, it is synonymous with a secondary suite, and when contained within an accessory structure, it is synonymous with a garden suite. For the purpose of this bylaw, an accessory dwelling unit is not a multi-unit residential use. Commercial use, small scale, means the use of land, buildings, or structures for small-scale commerce uses that are compatible with predominantly residential neighborhoods with 3 or less employees, and includes, but without limiting the generality of the following: convenience stores, salons, cafes, small offices, small retail stores, small artisan or craft studios, small-scale food production, and small bakeries. This does not include automobile-oriented commerce, commerce that involves a large outdoor developed footprint, downtown-oriented commerce, tourist-oriented commerce, cannabis retail, heavy industrial use, light industrial use, forestry use, campground, resource excavation use, utility use, warehousing, licensed premises, or adult entertainment. There's also limitations on subdivisions in low intensity zones. That includes this zone as well as the C1, C2, and the natural hazard overlay zones. So in those zones, there cannot be a subdivision of more than 3 lots. There sometimes can be exemptions where that's being added to another lot. Um, if there was pre-existing lots, there's some flexibility as well. And then in a lot of ways, it kind of filters into a conservation easement, the way it could be developed further. So the next zone is the R2 zone. This is rural settlement for corridor mixed use rural settlement with population growth potential. Larger scale commercial, residential, institutional, tourism, forestry, and small scale agriculture. So we have the same main uses allowed as the previous zone. Where things are a little bit different is you have those additional main uses that are limited in floor area, but this time they're limited to 500 square meters, so quite a bit bigger. Um, and instead of small scale commercial uses, now large scale commercial uses are allowed. I think the lot standards are pretty much the same. Um, So I think the only kind of new definition here is the large scale commercial use. That's the use of land, buildings, or structures for commerce purposes and includes both automobile oriented commerce, such as, but without limiting the generality of the following: gas stations, car washes, mechanic shops, drive-through restaurants, restaurants or retail with greater than 20 off-street parking spaces and automobile dealerships. Commerce that involves a large outdoor developed footprint, such as, but without limiting the generality of the following: nurseries, garden centers, contractors' yards, fuel depots, equipment leasing centers, building supply yards, and self-storage unit. This use may include any use listed under the medium-scale commercial use or small-scale commercial use definition, but does not include cannabis retail, heavy industrial use, light industrial use, forestry use, campground, resource excavation use, utility use, warehousing, or adult entertainment. The last rural zone is the rural resource zone, which is for low population density, agriculture, forestry, resource development, recreation, utility, and secondary residential land uses. The main uses allowed are agriculture, conservation, forestry, a pre-existing use, if you remember that one from earlier, resource excavation use, and utility use. Secondary uses. So you'll notice a dwelling or residential use is not an allowed main use. You would have to have one of these main uses, but it should be fairly uh, easy to have one of these main uses and meet the zone standards. And then you can have a secondary use, which is a camp, dwelling, or mini home. Again, if you have a pre-existing one of those, it's an allowed use that can continue and expand. There's also some limited secondary uses for institutional and small scale commercial. The idea with this zone is really to preserve it for the more intensive land-based resource activities that are the main allowed uses. It has a large minimum lot size, 2 hectares or 5 acres. It has significant frontage, especially where there's not public streets. Typically, this zone does not fall on public streets. And this here talks about how a main use does need to be 75% of the lot area, but again, where you have conservation, fairly easy to meet that, or even forestry. And lots of folks are moving to areas like this and engaging in these activities. So it's actually fairly easy to get a building permit for your dwelling here as long as you're engaging in one of those main uses. So let's talk about agriculture. Really, when we're talking about agriculture, it's about animals and livestock, vegetable gardening, trees, horticulture, uh, generally not an issue for neighbors. So it's where animals are involved that things can get complicated. So what an agricultural use means, and all of this is coming directly from the Department of Agriculture. These are their best practices, their standards. Using these types of definitions and general standards means that if there are conflicts, they can be dealt with under the Agriculture Operations Practices Act, and are not necessarily something that just falls to a civil matter between neighbors or land use enforcement. So this is basically it refers to that Agricultural Operations Practices Act. It includes greenhouses, nurseries, fish hatcheries, aquaculture, outdoor cannabis production, retail farmers markets, outlets for the sale of agricultural goods, kennels, animal shelters, and veterinary services, but does not include an industrial abattoir, industrial uses, or warehousing. So with this zone, it deals a lot with animal units, and those are based on the nutrient loads that come from the different amounts of manure that's produced by these animals. So it changes depending on the type of animal and generally how big it is. So one animal unit is one horse, cow, steer, bull, mule, donkey, bison, four ostriches, emus, llamas, sheep, goats, hogs, seven alpacas, a deer, 35 geese, foxes, minks, rabbits, or 120 chickens, including layers, broilers, turkey, broilers. So where agriculture uses are allowed, if you are going to have livestock, you need an acre of land per animal unit. There are exemptions if you have an approved Livestock Operations Act, but then you're very much governed by what the province is licensed you to do. The livestock facility shall be located more than 60 meters from any potable water source, natural water course, and or existing dwelling unit on an adjacent lot. Where agriculture uses are developed adjacent to a lot in the R1 or R2 zone, a naturally vegetated or trade buffer of 5 meters is required at or near the entire shared lot line or as mutually agreed to by the relevant lot owners in writing at the time of the development permit application. Livestock shall not be permitted to roam within 30 meters of a natural water course, a dwelling unit on an adjacent lot, or beyond lot lines, except where mutually agreed by the relevant lot owners in writing. Agricultural uses shall be conducted in conformity with acceptable farm practices as defined under the Agriculture Operations Practices Act. In any zone, mature female chickens, turkeys, or ducks or equivalent small fowl may be kept as accessory uses of a lot, but are subject to the following conditions. So these are allowed uses even if it doesn't say agriculture is an allowed main use. A combined total of 6 mature female chickens, female ducks, or equivalent smaller female fowl may be kept on one lot, but no male fowl that have reached maturation, like roosters, may be kept except where permitted by actual agriculture allowed uses. Any fowl require an enclosure and shall not be permitted to roam beyond lot lines. And within the urban service boundary, which is more or less the former town boundaries, the enclosure shall not be located in the front or flankage yard and must be at least 10 meters from any lot line. Manure from the fowl shall not be permitted to accumulate so as to create odors detectable at any lot line. Feed provided to the fowl shall be stored and distributed in a manner so as not to attract rodents. These agriculture standards are really there to protect adjacent properties and water sources. So now we're getting into the urban zones. As you can see here, this is kind of all within the former town boundaries. This zone is the low intensity urban settlement U1 for up to 4-unit residential, home-based business, secondary, small scale commercial, and institutional. This zone is very similar to the existing service residential zone. I will actually talk about a comparison of all the zones at the end, but this is quite similar to that zone. So I won't actually spend much time talking about it because it's, again, very similar lot standards. There is a few cases where this is not a fully serviced lot, so there's some standards that deal with unserviced lots, having to be an acre and all those things. So this allows for dwellings, parks and open space use, secondary uses, accessory dwelling units, short-term rentals. Within the urban zone, short-term rentals, except for the highest intensity urban zone, which I'll talk about, they have to be a secondary use. There has to be a main dwelling with a main long-term resident who occupies it. That can be used as a short-term rental when that occupant is not there, but there has to be that main long-term occupant. You can also have secondary institutional uses and home-based businesses so long as the floor area is limited to 200 square meters. We've covered all those definitions already, so we're going to move to the next zone, which is the medium intensity urban settlement zone for up to 8-unit residential, neighborhood commercial, and institutional. And so this is some of the current mixed use zone, some of the institutional zone, some of the lots adjacent to the busier streets, which have some of these uses already. So this zone allows for dwellings and institutional use and parks and open space use. You can have a main small scale commercial use up to 200 square meters. So you don't have to have one of these to have a small scale commercial use like in the previous zone to have a home-based business. But you can still do a home-based business. There's a fairly high degree of flexibility within this zone. This zone only exists within serviced areas, so the lot standards are geared towards that. You can see the maximum building height over here. The maximum population density is up to 8 dwelling units, so you can't have more than 8 dwelling units on one site. And I'll talk about urban design a little bit, but there's no actual distinction between are these 8 separate units or the 8 combined units, 4 groups of 2, 2 groups of 4. We found lots of rezonings coming to council for slightly unorthodox arrangements of buildings, and in a time when housing affordability and trying to have more people in mixed use pedestrian areas is really important. That type of friction can really lead to issues. So this is an attempt to make that type of development a little bit more flexible, as well with the retail, making that easier. If you're going to have population growth in areas, it makes sense to allow associated retail growth within the character of the neighborhood. That gives people more options. And the hope is that entrepreneurs see a market and can take advantage of that within the zoning bylaw and help grow the community in ways that still reflect the existing character. I've put up the small scale commercial use definition again, just to remind folks of what that is. I won't read through it. And I will talk about the urban design standards. So where you have higher density and institutional residential uses, where there's more than 6 dwelling units, residential care facility or rooming house, one main building entrance has to orient towards the front lot line. If there's a main building, any main building with a flat roof shall include a cornice, be covered entrance with weather protection such as portico or awning, and be directly connected to any public sidewalk or street, be it paved or dust-free pedestrian walkway. It does not traverse through a parking lot other than where necessary to cross driveway access. For developments consisting of multiple buildings, pedestrian walkways shall connect separate buildings. Except for any north-facing walls, the facades of each story, the main building shall include a minimum of 18% coverage of transparent glazing. Landscaped outdoors, 56 square meters of amenity space shall be provided, plus an addition 7 meters squared for every 100 meters squared of gross floor area of the main building. Landscape outdoor amenity areas shall not be located in a parking lot, front or flankage yard, but shall be fully enclosed by a minimum 2-meter tall opaque fence and gate and a cigarette disposal container located in compliance with the Smoke-Free Places Act. Where more than 20 dwelling units are developed, an indoor amenity space of 56 square meters shall be provided, plus an additional 7 square meters for every 200 square meters of gross floor area of the main buildings. Notwithstanding anything in the bylaw, a residential care facility or a rooming house shall not be developed in the U1 zone without an amendment to this bylaw. Notwithstanding anything contained in this bylaw, a residential care facility for more than 8 occupants or a rooming house for more than 8 occupants shall not be developed in the U2 zone without an amendment to this bylaw. Urban standards for townhouse developments. In the U2 or U3 zone, a series of more than 2 individual dwelling units attached in a series may be developed subject to the following standards. The building facade shall be articulated to denote individual dwelling units. Garages shall not have a door that exceeds 75% of the ground floor building facade of each dwelling unit, and garages shall be recessed from the facade by at least 1 meter. Notwithstanding um, those that previous policy, garage opening may orient toward the rear lot line. No series of attached dwelling units shall exceed 6 dwelling units with the same approximate front lot line or 68.68 meters in continuous length. Notwithstanding the zone standards, because these are typically, they might be divided in a fee simple subdivision. So you need to have a separate kind of minimum lot size, minimum lot frontage per dwelling unit, and side yard because you might have a common wall right on the property line. These can also be developed as condominiums. That subsection applies as if each dwelling unit was on its own lot. Okay, so moving into the U3 high intensity urban settlement zone. This is for high density residential, downtown or medium scale commercial, and institutional uses. So this is a lot of the existing central commercial zone, uh, as well as some of the bigger institutional uses like MBCC, campground, uh, Huntsman, biological station, and those higher density residential uses, Anchor's Landing, Compass, some of the ones that have received recent rezonings, things like that. So the main uses look fairly similar, except you can now have a medium scale commercial use. I'll talk about that. Everything else, I think, fairly standard. The maximum building height is a little bit taller here based on existing development. The zone standards, fairly generous setbacks, although there is an overlay zone for the historic business district, which changes these things. There's a larger setback required when abutting a lower intensity zone. And fairly small minimum lot size. Again, you have a lot of compact urban development for the zone. So the new definition here is a medium scale commercial use. That's the use of land, buildings, or structures for commerce and includes downtown oriented commerce, such as, but without limiting the generality, offices, grocery stores, pharmacies, retail stores, restaurants, licensed premises, microbreweries, theaters, entertainment centers, artisan or craft studios, banks, offices, art galleries, and tourist-oriented commerce, such as, but without limiting the generality of the following: hotel, tourist accommodations with on-site guest services, short-term rentals, spas, tour adventure outfitters, bike scooter rentals, and amphitheaters. This can also include any small-scale commercial use, does not include the large-scale commercial uses like automobile-oriented commerce, commerce with large developed footprint, cannabis retail, industrial uses, forestry, campground, resource excavation, utility use, warehousing, or adult entertainment. So those are the main zones, and we're into the special zones. Integrated development zone is really a zone that exists when council wants to do something that is completely outside of any of the other zones. Doesn't make sense to amend those zones. Very unusual developments. There's been a few previously in the current Z22 zoning bylaw. With a slightly more flexible zoning bylaw, the zone may not be needed, but it's there in case it is. And really everything gets done through development agreements with council, public hearings, just like there is a rezoning. The historic business district overlay zone, I mentioned previously, kind of overlays on some of those U3 properties where the historic business district is, and does a few different things. So this is an area where council has stated they want a lot of control. And it seems like the best way to do this is where you have pretty much any development requiring a development or building permit. Council has the ability to, well, basically has to go through a rezoning process. It's called a development scheme bylaw. But it effectively is a fairly involved process, including public hearings and readings of council. There's a few cases where that would not be required, where there are those maybe a renovation. Um, if something is going through the Heritage Conservation Act and bylaw process, then that is dealing with these matters. So council would not need to be involved. There may be requirements for accessibility. There may be things for dangerous and unsightly. So there's a few cases where council would not be involved, as well as for very minor things. Um, where new development does happen, there are some basic standards. These are very much in line with the secondary municipal plan design guidelines for the historic business district. Maximum building height, buildings with flat roofs required to have cornices, transparency at ground levels, making sure windows are consistent across the building, and traditional building materials for facades, exterior cladding, and doors. Uh, I did mention this has you can have a much larger developed footprint in this zone. You can actually use 100% of the lot for buildings and structures, which is in some cases the case in this area. Maximum lot setbacks instead of minimum, except for side yard, which has no required setback. Again, you have buildings cheek by jowl in these areas, and you want that pattern to continue. Having a building significantly set back would be very detrimental to the urban design. And you can have very small lots here with minimum frontages. Again, this is a very compact urban area, and this is kind of putting pretty significant parameters on that. Another special zone, I guess two zones, the natural hazard overlay zones. These are sea level rise areas based on provincial projections for the year 2100, both the high tide and the 1% storm surge. So the red areas, ONH1, that's the high tide, and these have more significant limitations because this is basically a daily occurrence. So this zone is intended to limit those developments, limit development pretty significantly. And so really the only things that can be developed without amending the bylaw or variances are accessory structures, small accessory structures, accessory uses of land, alterations that are not including expanding the building, conservation uses, um, and I guess this does, let's go back here. It does allow for wheelchair ramps, stairs, and decks. So those are, fairly minor developments. Things to shore up the um, shoreline with specifically green practices, parks and open space, and other shore protection works, as well as utility uses. But these kind of critical municipal functions that, if inundated, would cause significant issues are not allowed in this zone. The lower risk zone, ONH2, those are the yellow areas here. That's your 1% storm surge. It is talking about adapting development to these risks. They're not necessarily going to be every day, might not even be every year. In this case, you would have to provide engineered plans that show that the elevation of the habitable part of the building, including all electrical, mechanical, and plumbing, are at least 60 centimeters above the projected sea level rise, which is defined and mapped by the province. Okay, so some technical difficulties. Hopefully the recording is still working okay. So just gonna go back, talk about how the zones compare to one another. You've got the Z25 on the left here, all the zones we've just talked about, and the comparable zones from the Bayside Rural Plan, Shamcook Rural Plan, or Z22, the current Town of St. Andrews zoning bylaw. So the C1 zone, that high priority conservation, the watershed zone of the Bayside and Shamcook Rural Plan, St. Croix Corridor, and the environmentally significant areas zone of Z22 were extremely limiting of development. C2 zone, the watershed zone from Bayside and Shamcook, it did just refer to the provincial regulation, so it depended on where you were, how limited development was. The Minister's Island zone and the Shamcook Rural Plan, the Green Space Zone, where you had a lot of parks, the Navy Island zone, where you had some residential but very limited development. The industrial zone, the Bayside Rural Plan had an industrial zone where the industrial park is, but there were a lot of uses allowed in the rural zone, like light industrial uses, in both of those plans that have kind of been shifted into the industrial zone and out of those areas. So the rural low intensity zone or low impact settlement, the rural zone of the Bayside and Chippewa Plan allowed for so many uses that it's really been broken up into multiple zones to better define those areas. So you'll see it come up again and again, but it allowed those basic residential uses and some of the secondary institutional things like that. The estate residential zone in Z22 was also this kind of larger lot unserviced development. The R2 zone, again, that's the one right along 127, the higher intensity rural zone. We're taking some of the uses from the existing rural plan rural zone, but again, not all of them. Some of those go to R1, some of those go to industrial, some of those go to R3. So things like agriculture, forestry, those are going to R3. In the urban zones, I mentioned U1. You've got the very, I think, almost identical to the service residential zone. The estate residential zone where you don't have services, there's a few of those lots which are the U1 zone. The U2 zone, I think, is the biggest change. It's a lot of the existing mixed use zone, but it does allow for a true mixing of uses, unlike that zone, which kind of funnels you into a use from another zone. The MR1 zone, the multi-residential, the low density multi-residential that exists within the town plat, and institutional uses. Those are all reflected in the U2 zone. The U3 zone, you've got those the true mixed use zones like central commercial, which does allow for any number of residential uses. Tourist commercial, MR2, the high density residential, service residential, cultural, which is just Kira and the amphitheater, and the institutional zone. So you can kind of see how the rural zones got split up over multiple zones and the urban zones got condensed into fewer zones. Trying to go to the next slide here. So we've talked about the zones. I'll finish up talking about signs. This is probably most relevant if you are a business owner. There's a bunch of different kinds of signs. The current zoning bylaw is very complicated. It's about 10 pages of signs. We've gotten it down to 3 pages. We've put together a nice table which clearly shows which zones different signs are allowed in. The signs all have different definitions. So this is the different types of sign. You've got your billboard, your community sign. This is just describing the sign face, flag signs, freestanding signs. Those are those large, typically they're fixed to the ground signs, illuminated signs. Kind of these small incidental signs. They're typically exempt from any requirements. Point of purchase signs, portable signs, projecting signs. Those are the signs you typically see them in the historic business district that project perpendicular to a building. Sandwich board signs, wall signs, and window signs. So you can see here, Some signs are exempted. Window signs, most of these signs we're dealing um, with, they're either in rural zones or they're in the high intensity urban zone. There's a few that do become allowed in the U2 zone, projecting signs, awning signs, small wall signs, freestanding signs. Um, there's some that are very limited, like portable signs, really just rural zones and industrial zones. Um, and then finally, billboard signs are clearly prohibited in every zone, as are most large illuminated signs, although they may get terms and conditions from the advisory committee. So those are the different types of signs and where they're allowed. Um, these are all the standards for the advertising signs. And again, these are really mostly applicable in urban areas in the urban service boundary. Um, they're really, I think, only going to be relevant to you if you're actually planning on, putting up a sign. Most of these only apply in kind of the central or the U3 zone. So this talks about how big signs can be, um, where they can be located, how much they can project, how tall they can be, things like that. Um, Certain limitations on how long portable signs can be displayed. But I'm not going to read through everything. Again, if you have questions, you are welcome to get in. So we've basically come to the end of going through everything. Um, the next steps are, at this point, you probably are reviewing the zoning bylaw and maps. So hopefully you found them. If you found this recording, I'm sure they're very close by. If you just have general feedback, concerns, or support, you can get in touch with council to this email address. If, as I said before, if you have questions, I'm probably the best person to get in touch with. So here's my contact information. And we do have some tentative public information and feedback sessions scheduled for January of 2026, next year. The 14th at the arena or somewhere in the municipality, or sorry, it's in the former town boundaries. January 20th will be a virtual session using Zoom, and January 22nd will be at the Bayside Community Hall. So that's really it. I hope you found this informative. And again, if you have questions, please do get in touch. Come to a feedback session. If you think this, all sounds really good, then I think it's definitely a good thing to let council know. As well as if you think there's issues or you think your property is in the incorrect zone or anything like that. Those are very important things for council to know at this time. So I hope you enjoy whatever else you're going to do. And maybe I'll see you at one of the public information sessions.